Welcome to Hard Script.
I found out on a Tuesday because my calendar went quiet before my phone did. No alerts. No shared reminders. No comments on the operating plan I'd uploaded at 6:42 a.m. like I did every morning. Just silence where there was usually friction. By 9:15, my phone buzzed with a Slack notification that wasn't meant for me. A channel I'd helped build. A thread I'd structured. Her name and his stacked together under a revenue forecast that hadn't been approved yet. By 10, my wife said it out loud in our kitchen, like she was stating a preference, not ending a marriage. She said we were married, and that didn't mean she owed me anything. No apology. No explanation. She said it the way people say they're changing phone plans. Final. Administrative. My name is Daniel Harper, 46. Chief Operating Officer at a regional distribution company that moves product through 3 states and never misses a deadline. I don't raise my voice. I don't improvise. I build systems that don't require emotion to function. My wife, Claire, was our brand manager. External face. Internal leverage. She talked about growth the way I talked about risk. Faster. Louder. Always forward-facing. The man she was seeing wasn't a stranger. He was Mark Ellison, our commercial partner. The one who had access to margins, vendor schedules, pricing strategy. The one I'd vouched for when legal raised concerns. The one who sat at our table during quarterly dinners and asked about my kids. She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. By 11:30, she'd already packed a gym bag and updated her Instagram bio. Something about alignment and choosing herself. I noticed because the company account followed her and the notification crossed my screen while I was approving freight insurance renewals. At noon, Mark sent a text. Just logistics. Wanted to sync later about a supplier call. No mention of Claire. No mention of anything else. At 12:07, I forwarded a calendar invite cancellation to myself and removed my personal email from our shared cloud drive. At 1:30, I requested an access audit from IT. Routine language. No flags. At 3, Claire posted a story. Wine glasses. A caption about freedom. At 5, I got home and the house felt staged. Like a model unit no one lived in. At 7, she didn't come back. At 8, I opened a notebook and wrote 4 words, not as thoughts, but as steps. Accept. Isolate. Close. Exit. She said she owed me nothing. I decided to take her at her word. By Wednesday morning, the office felt different, even though nothing had changed. Same fluorescent hum. Same warehouse reports hitting my inbox at predictable intervals. Same logistics dashboard blinking green across all 3 regions. The difference was how people paused when they saw me. Not long enough to be obvious. Just enough to register. Claire hadn't called in. She'd logged into the brand account remotely and scheduled 2 posts for the week. Pre-approved assets. Nothing personal. Just presence. Mark showed up at 10 for the weekly partner sync. He walked in like he always did. Confident posture. Casual smile. He didn't mention my wife. He didn't need to. He spoke in numbers and timelines, like nothing else existed. I listened. I always listened. At 10:38, while he talked through a revised vendor incentive proposal, I noticed something he didn't. The forecast assumed access he technically no longer had. A shared folder he'd been using for years without formal authorization. One of those quiet exceptions that lives forever because no one challenges it. I didn't interrupt him. At 11:15, after he left, I forwarded the meeting notes to legal with a single line. Request review of partner access scope. No urgency. No accusation. At noon, I had lunch at my desk and watched the engagement metrics on Claire's post climb. Comments praising her courage. People she barely knew cheering a version of her I'd never met. She replied to none of them. At 1, HR confirmed receipt of my request to separate spousal access from internal systems. They asked if there was a conflict. I replied that there was a change in household structure. That was all. At 2:40, IT completed the audit. Nothing dramatic. Just a list. Accounts. Permissions. Touchpoints. Claire still had access to 2 dashboards she didn't need anymore. Mark had 3 he'd never been approved for. I didn't shut anything down yet. At 4, I received a text from Claire. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It said she'd be staying with a friend for a while and asked when I'd be home to pick up a few more things. I replied that I wouldn't be available that evening. At 5:30, I stayed late and reviewed our partnership agreements line by line. Not for loopholes. For structure. Dates. Dependencies. What broke if one name came off a document? At 7, the office emptied. The building went quiet in the way only operational spaces do. No drama, just systems waiting. I opened a new folder on my drive and labeled it Transition. Inside, I placed copies of everything that still worked. By the time I locked my office and walked to my car, I wasn't thinking about Claire or Mark. I was thinking about sequence. She said she owed me nothing. I was beginning to understand how literal that could be. Thursday started with a board notification that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with timing. A vendor escalation in the northern region. Missed delivery window. Potential penalty. I handled it before 8:30, reassigned routing, approved the surcharge, closed the loop. The system worked because it always had. Claire texted again at 9:12. Short. Polite. She needed access to the shared finance folder for a presentation Mark was preparing. She said it was time-sensitive. I didn't respond. At 9:40, Mark emailed instead. CC'd his assistant. Framed it as efficiency. He said Claire had flagged an issue with brand alignment tied to a Q3 push. He needed the numbers. I forwarded the message to IT and asked them to confirm current access permissions. I used neutral language. Past tense. At 10:20, IT replied. Access had already been downgraded overnight as part of the audit. No errors. No overrides. At 10:35, Mark showed up unannounced. He stood in my doorway like he belonged there. Same confidence. Same relaxed tone. He talked about alignment and momentum and how personal situations shouldn't disrupt professional flow. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. I let him finish. When he stopped talking, I told him the partnership review was scheduled for the following week and all requests should go through legal until then. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify it. He smiled, but his eyes recalculated. At 11, legal confirmed what I already knew. The partnership agreement included a morality clause. Standard language. Rarely enforced. It didn't mention affairs or spouses. It mentioned conflicts that compromised fiduciary trust. At noon, Claire posted another story. Brunch. Sunlight. A caption about boundaries. At 1, HR finalized the internal separation notice. Claire's role would transition to external consultant pending review. Standard process when household ties intersected with vendor relationships. No drama. Just policy. At 2:15, my phone buzzed with a missed call from Claire. No voicemail. At 3, I reviewed Mark's latest projections. They were aggressive. Dependent on discounts that hadn't been negotiated yet. Dependent on goodwill. At 4:30, legal sent me a draft notice. It outlined a temporary suspension of shared data access pending conflict resolution. My name was the only signature required. I signed it. At 6, I came home to find Claire in the kitchen. Boxes half-packed. Calm. Controlled. She said she thought I was being cold. She said marriage wasn't a transaction. I nodded. I told her I agreed. At 7, she left again. This time with everything she'd need for a while. At 9, I shut down the shared calendar. The house didn't echo. It stabilized. She said she owed me nothing. By the end of Thursday, neither of them owed me access either. Friday made the consequences visible. At 8:10, Mark's assistant emailed asking why the shared drive was empty on their end. She phrased it like a glitch. Temporary. Fixable. At 8:22, legal replied before I did. They referenced the suspension notice and copied Mark directly. Professional tone. No blame. Just procedure. At 9, Claire texted again. Longer this time. She said this was becoming hostile. She said she didn't understand why I was mixing personal issues with work. She said Mark felt blindsided. I read it once. I didn't respond. At 9:45, Mark called. I let it ring. At 10, the CFO forwarded me a note from Mark questioning whether our partnership was still aligned. He used the word trust. He used it carefully, like it was fragile and external, not something he'd handled. I replied with a single sentence. The partnership was under routine review due to a disclosed conflict. Further communication should go through counsel. At 11, Claire showed up at the office. She didn't come to my floor. She went to HR. I found out because HR asked if I'd like to join the conversation. I declined. They didn't push. At noon, the brand account went dark. Scheduled posts paused. Comments unanswered. Someone noticed. Engagement dipped. At 1:15, Mark emailed again. This time, no assistant. No CC. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said he valued transparency. He said this didn't have to get complicated. At 1:17, legal sent him the formal notice. Temporary data freeze. Contractual review window. Estimated timeline. No emotion. At 2, Claire sent her last message of the day. She said she never thought I'd try to control her. She said autonomy meant consequences, not punishment. I didn't argue with the definition. At 3:30, I approved the reassignment of a key distribution route from Mark's firm to his secondary partner. Contingency planning. No announcement. Just execution. At 5, Mark's quarterly forecast auto-updated. Numbers turned red. At 6, I left the office on time. The parking lot was half full. People were still working, still speculating. At 7, I cooked dinner for 1 and ate standing up. At 9, Claire posted again. No location. No tags. A quote about being untethered. At 10, my phone stayed silent. By the end of Friday, the narrative had shifted without anyone raising their voice. She said marriage didn't mean obligation. The systems I ran agreed. They adjusted accordingly. Monday removed the illusion that this was temporary. At 7:58, the legal team circulated the agenda for the partnership review. Standard language. Neutral framing. Claire's name wasn't on it. At 8:30, Mark's firm missed a pickup window in the southern corridor. Not catastrophic. Just expensive. The system rerouted automatically, but the surcharge landed on his margin, not ours. At 9, Claire emailed from her personal account. She said she felt erased. She said I was pretending she didn't exist. She said silence was manipulation. I read it between calls and archived it. At 10:15, the board chair requested a brief update. No urgency, just awareness. I summarized facts. Household separation. Active conflict disclosure. Temporary mitigation steps. He thanked me for being thorough. At 11, Mark's assistant requested access again. Different phrasing. She said they were falling behind and clients were asking questions. Legal responded before I saw it. At noon, Claire showed up at the house while I was at work. I found out later because the security system logged the entry. She stayed 27 minutes. She didn't take anything. At 1, Mark emailed the CFO. He suggested the freeze was hurting the brand and implied my judgment might be compromised. He didn't name me. He didn't have to. At 1:30, the CFO forwarded it to me with a single line asking for context. I replied with the compliance memo and the timestamp disclosure. At 2, HR confirmed Claire's consultant status was under review. The phrase they used was material overlap. At 3:15, Mark requested an emergency call. I declined and forwarded the request to counsel. At 4, Claire texted again. She said she never expected this version of me. She said she thought I'd fight. She said she thought I'd want to talk. I didn't correct her. At 5, the review meeting ended early. Legal flagged unresolved risk. Mark's firm would remain limited until further notice. At 6:30, I came home and found an envelope on the counter. Claire's handwriting. Inside was a key and a note saying she was giving me space. At 7, Mark posted a vague update on LinkedIn about resilience and partnership challenges. It got traction. At 8, I deleted my account. At 9, I closed the joint credit card. At 10, the house was quiet again. She said autonomy meant not owing anything. By Monday night, the system had accepted that premise completely. It stopped extending trust where it wasn't required. Tuesday is when pressure stopped being abstract. At 8:05, legal sent a revised memo. Mark's firm was now flagged for elevated review due to overlapping personal and financial exposure. Language tightened. Timelines extended. At 8:30, Mark's CFO requested a call with ours. It didn't happen. Calendars stayed empty. At 9, Claire emailed again. Shorter. Sharper. She said she felt punished. She said I was using structure to avoid accountability. She said silence wasn't strength. I read it while approving warehouse overtime and closed the tab. At 10:15, Mark arrived at the building without an appointment. Security logged him in and called my assistant. I said I was unavailable. He waited anyway. At 11, he left. His exit time showed up in the system like any other data point. At noon, I met with compliance. Routine review. They asked if there had been any undisclosed exchanges. I told them everything had been documented the day the household separation occurred. They nodded. Notes were taken. At 1, Claire showed up at my office. She stood in the doorway long enough for people to notice, then walked in and closed it behind her. She didn't sit. She said this wasn't what she meant. She said she thought I'd react like a person, not a process. I didn't argue. I told her legal timelines were already in motion and any communication should go through counsel. I told her I hoped she was well. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, then stopped. She looked around the office like she was seeing it for the first time. the screens, the binders, the quiet. She left without saying goodbye. At 2:30, Mark's firm lost a secondary client. Not because of me, because uncertainty spreads. At 3, I signed the notice formalizing my withdrawal from the Joint Advisory Committee. My name came off 3 documents and 2 standing meetings disappeared from my calendar. At 4, Claire posted again. No captions this time. Just a mirror selfie. Comments filled in the meaning for her. At 5:30, the board chair sent a brief message thanking me for maintaining operational stability under complex circumstances. At 6, I drove home and found the garage half empty. Claire had taken the rest of her things. At 8, Mark sent one last email. He said this didn't have to end this way. He said bridges mattered. I didn't reply. At 10, I shut down the last shared account. She said marriage didn't create obligation. By Tuesday night, neither did partnership. Wednesday was when the silence started to echo back. At 8, legal finalized the interim findings. Mark's firm was now categorized as a conditional partner. Temporary language, permanent consequences. Review cycle extended another 90 days. At 8:45, our procurement system auto-triggered a rebalance. Volumes shifted quietly to alternate vendors. No announcement, just math correcting itself. At 9:30, Claire emailed from a new address. She said she was meeting with a lawyer. She said she didn't want things to get ugly. She said we could still be reasonable. I forwarded the message to counsel and deleted it from my inbox. At 10, Mark's LinkedIn post disappeared. Comments along with it. Screenshots live longer than confidence, but I didn't take any. At 11, finance flagged a discrepancy in Mark's last submitted invoice. Nothing illegal, just optimistic. It went back for revision. At noon, the brand account was officially reassigned. Claire's access expired without ceremony. The password reset notification hit my dashboard and cleared itself. At 1, HR asked if I wanted to issue a formal internal update. I said no. Facts didn't need commentary. At 2:15, Mark called my assistant again. This time, he sounded tired. She noted it. She didn't put him through. At 3, Claire showed up at the house. I wasn't there. The cameras caught her sitting on the front steps for a while before leaving. She didn't knock. At 4:30, the board approved the contingency expansion. Additional resources allocated. My department's authority widened by default. At 5, I received a calendar invite from Mark titled Reset. I declined without explanation. At 6, I went for a run. Same route. Same pace. The city didn't look different. It just felt less crowded. At 8, Claire posted again. This time, no quotes. Just a photo of a packed suitcase. At 9, Mark's firm lost its exclusivity clause. Legal language. Quiet shift. Long-term impact. At 10, I sat at the kitchen table and signed the draft separation agreement my lawyer had prepared earlier that week. Asset division. Timelines. Clear boundaries. At 11, I placed the signed copy in the outgoing folder. She said marriage didn't mean obligation. By Wednesday night, that principle had been applied evenly. No access without trust. No proximity without alignment. Nothing personal. Just final. Thursday arrived without resistance. At 8:20, my lawyer confirmed receipt of Claire's response. She'd requested a modification to the timeline. Nothing dramatic. Just delay. At 8:45, I approved the revised delivery contracts. Mark's firm was no longer referenced by name. A placeholder replaced it, then filled itself. At 9, Claire texted for the first time in 2 days. She asked if we could talk before things became official. She said closure mattered. I didn't answer. At 10, Mark's firm submitted a formal appeal to reinstate partial access. Legal reviewed it, flagged unresolved risk, and returned it with conditions they wouldn't accept. At 11, the appeal died quietly. At noon, I met with operations to finalize the new distribution map. Routes shortened. Costs stabilized. No dependency on a single partner. At 1, Claire posted something longer than usual. A caption about learning who people really are when things get uncomfortable. Comments rallied. Assumptions filled the gaps. At 2:15, the court acknowledged our filing. The date was set. No urgency. Just progression. At 3, Mark sent a message through an intermediary. He said he didn't recognize me anymore. He said I was making this bigger than it needed to be. I never saw the message. My assistant handled it. At 4, compliance closed the review. No violations on our side. Full documentation. Clean record. At 5, the CFO stopped by my office. He said things had settled faster than expected. He said I'd handled it cleanly. I nodded. At 6, I came home to an empty house that finally felt intentional. The echo was gone. The air didn't hold unfinished sentences. At 7, Claire called. The phone rang long enough to be noticeable. I watched it stop. At 8, I forwarded her number to counsel. At 9, Mark's firm announced a restructuring. Public language. Private consequences. At 10, I signed the final operational withdrawal. My name disappeared from their future. At 11, I sat on the back steps and listened to the neighborhood. Cars. Wind. Nothing urgent. She said marriage didn't mean obligation. By Thursday night, I wasn't reacting to that anymore. I was living inside the result. No arguments left to win. No access left to revoke. Just distance, formalized and complete, moving on schedule. Friday closed the loop. At 8:10, my lawyer confirmed Claire had signed. No counteroffers. No last-minute language. Just acceptance. The document moved from draft to record. At 8:30, the court stamped it received. The date didn't feel heavy. It felt logged. At 9, Mark's firm missed another performance threshold. This one triggered an automatic downgrade in our internal risk model. The notification appeared and cleared without comment. At 10, Claire emailed again. Short. Neutral. She said she didn't expect things to end like this. She said she thought independence would feel different. I read it once and archived it with the rest. At 11, the board approved the final vendor transition. Mark's firm was formally removed from the preferred list. No announcement. Just an update in the system that would ripple outward over quarters, not days. At noon, I ate lunch outside for the first time all week. The air was sharp, clear. The city moved without noticing me. At 1, HR closed Claire's file. Consultant status terminated by mutual agreement. Standard language. No commentary. At 2, Mark tried one last angle. He reached out through a mutual contact. The message was framed as concern. He said I'd gone too far. He said relationships weren't meant to be run like machines. I never received it directly. At 3, finance confirmed final reconciliation. No shared liabilities. No surprises. At 4, Claire's social presence went quiet. No posts. No stories. The feed froze where it was. At 5, I left work early. Not because I needed to. Because I could. At 6, I boxed the last remaining shared items in the house. Old photos. Duplicate keys. A few things that never found a place again. I labeled the box and set it by the door. At 7, Claire arrived to pick it up. I didn't open the door. The camera logged the time. She waited a minute, then left with the box. At 8, Mark's firm announced a leadership change. Public explanation. Private fallout. At 9, I shut off the last shared notification channel. My phone stayed still. At 10, I sat in the living room with no screens on and listened to the house exist as itself. She said marriage didn't mean obligation. By Friday night, neither did memory. Everything that required access had been closed. Everything that required distance had been given it. The system had finished what it started. Only one step remained. Saturday was quiet in a way that didn't ask for attention. No notifications. No calendar blocks. No pending approvals. The systems I'd spent years building were running without me touching anything. That was the point. At 8, I woke up without an alarm. The house stayed still. No footsteps that weren't mine. No sounds that needed interpreting. At 9, I reviewed the final confirmation from the court. Everything processed. Effective immediately. The language was clean. No room for interpretation. At 10, I transferred the last remaining joint asset into escrow. The confirmation came back seconds later. Balanced. Closed. At 11, Mark's name appeared one last time in my inbox. Not a message. A system alert. His firm had been fully offboarded from our network. Access revoked. Credentials expired. Nothing dramatic. Just final. At noon, I went for a walk. No headphones. No phone in my hand. The city moved the way it always had. People passed me without recognizing anything had ended. At 1, Claire's lawyer confirmed receipt of the final transfer. No further action required. That phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. At 2, I cleared out the last folder on my drive labeled transition. Its contents were no longer active. I archived it and shut it down. At 3, the board sent a brief message acknowledging the conclusion of the review period. Operations stabilized. Risk resolved. They thanked me and moved on. At 4, I cooked a late lunch and ate it slowly. Sitting down this time. No screens. No metrics. At 5, I stood in the garage and looked at the space where her car used to be. It didn't feel empty. It felt available. At 6, Mark posted again. Something vague. Something about lessons learned. It didn't reach me. At 7, the sun dropped low and the house filled with long shadows that didn't belong to anyone else. At 8, I turned off the last remaining shared automation. The lights adjusted to my schedule only. At 9, I sat on the couch and let the quiet hold. She said marriage didn't mean obligation. I never argued with that. I accepted it. I applied it. And when everything that depended on obligation was removed, what remained didn't ask for anything at all. No explanations. No negotiations. No access. She said I owed her nothing. So I made sure she got exactly that.